Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, December 18, 2024. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. Colonel Macgregor, it's a busy time of year. We deeply appreciate you coming on the show, and thank you very much for your time. I do want to speak with you at some length on a terrific essay you have recently published at the American Conservative called America's Next War of Choice. But before we get there, some of the more pressing news. The assassination of General Kirillov in Moscow, a brazen murder on a public street right outside of the building where he was residing. Is there political or military significance to this?
Yes, I think there is. Ukrainians have been after him for some time. General Kirillov was the first, even before the special military operation began, to point out the biolabs that we helped to fund and create in Ukraine. Ultimately, there were 46 of them, most of them located along Ukraine's border with Russia. And he urged the army to go immediately into these biolabs, gather whatever evidence they could, and then destroy them. So that's the first thing. At the same time, he was also instrumental in pointing the army in the direction of the Kharkov Institute, which was the one facility in Ukraine where there was serious work going on to develop nuclear weapons. Specifically, they were trying to create the equivalent of a suitcase nuclear weapon. The Russian authorities did get to the institute. They shut it down, but unfortunately, they don't know how much was rescued from destruction and whether or not the Ukrainians got something out of it. Both of those were very horrific events as far as the Russians are concerned, because they found tangible, concrete evidence that the Ukrainians in these biolabs, with our help and assistance, were trying to develop weapons that were targeted genetically against Russians. Now, how they did this is anybody's guess. I don't know. I mean, genetically, Russians and Ukrainians are not that far apart. There are differences so that they could do something like that. But how far they got, I have no idea. In addition to which, there were other indications that organs were being harvested in these places from people as young as 6 months, 8 months, and sold on the black market or utilized for experimentation. There are a lot of horrific things that came out of that discovery, but it really shocked the Russians that we and the Ukrainians would do such a thing, and it made this special military operation all that much more important. And obviously, the Ukrainians were not happy about the fact that this information was discovered. So killing him right now isn't going to make much difference in terms of the inevitable victory of the Russian state in this war. But it's a way to punish someone who got to them, if you will.
What does this do in the mind of the Kremlin? Is it just, another general, or is it he was a scientist as well as a general? He devoted his life to the Russian state. This has to be avenged in a serious and profound way.
Yes, this is a person who fundamentally is a national hero, and I'm sure he will be honored as such. So his loss is something that people take very seriously, particularly at the top of the political structure. But the point is, why he wasn't adequately protected is a question I can't answer. Perhaps, once again, the Russians underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians to penetrate the borders and reach targets inside Russia. I don't know, but I'm sure a lot of hard questions are being asked, and others who may be involved in similar things will now receive more state security than they've had in the past.
Colonel, was the fall of President Assad a strategic defeat for the Kremlin?
I think it was a strategic embarrassment and setback. My perception is that ultimately the Russians will leave Syria entirely. They'll abandon Latakia, which is a very important base for them, and they'll move elsewhere. I don't think that they want to be hostage to whatever the Turks may try to do to people in Syria. In other words, if you remain in Syria and you recognize that Syria as such no longer exists. It's disintegrated. What's the point of staying there? And I think that's being seriously considered. I think the Russians will find another port and another base elsewhere where they will be welcomed and probably more secure.
Well, to your point, Colonel, the Guardian of London is reporting that Russia is moving its air defense systems out of Syria and into Libya. If that is accurate, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells us that Libya will be a home that they can depend upon. They'll have a base there, which is kind of interesting when you stop and think how hard we tried to eliminate Gaddafi and then destroy the place. The place ultimately ends up being friendly to Russia. I'm sure Hillary Clinton and her gang are very unhappy about that. Remember that for the purposes of the Russians, they were simply looking for a base for ships as well as aircraft where things could be refueled, rearmed. It's kind of a stop-off point on your way down into Central Africa, where the Russians have a number of positions. But beyond that, it was not a vital strategic necessity. The Russians are not fools. They cut their losses quickly when they see no point in further investment. I wish we would.
Colonel, before we go over to Iran, it is what remains of Syria, whether it's the part controlled by the Israelis, the part controlled by the Turks, or what remains under al-Jilani's control, safe for Christians?
It's a mixed bag. Numbers of Christians have already been decapitated, murdered. I think we're going to see more of it. Remember, these are jihadists. These are not moderates by any stretch of the imagination. The word tolerance does not exist in their vocabulary. I think Erdogan has undoubtedly advised them to exercise some restraint. Not that Erdogan particularly cares about Christians or Jews or anybody who's not a Muslim. But long term, I see no future for Christianity in Syria, sadly. And that's a tragedy, because Syria is probably the first place where a Christian church was established, not long after the demise of Christ. So it's another tragic event, but Christians have been steadily either killed or driven out of the region for several years right now. And this is probably unavoidable. The Shiites historically, and you may be surprised by this, or viewers have protected the Christians. The Shiite militias protected Christians in Iraq from ISIS. I think similar things have gone on inside Syria. And that's not a criticism of Sunnis, because in many states there were Sunni Islamic. There was a general tolerance for Jews and Christians as well. But in this case, that's over. I think we have to assume that the jihadists will behave as they have in the past, in terrible ways.
You mentioned beheadings. Has this occurred since Assad was driven out and al-Jilani took over?
Yes. I mean, all of this information, a lot of this information, not all of it, you can see on Telegram. You've got to go on and watch the videos that are posted there. The jihadists themselves post many of these videos. They're very proud of the fact that they're murdering people, and especially if they're Christians or accused of being former Assad supporters, whatever. This is an act of terrorism that they know strikes fear in the hearts of others in the region, and that's why they're doing it.
Would I be accurate in concluding that the CIA has no remorse for what it unleashed there?
Look, I don't think the CIA has remorse about anything. It could care less about human life. If we had any interest at all in human life, we would have stopped this fiasco in Ukraine a long time ago. Instead, they continue to lie about everything. Everybody does in the West. MI6, CIA, Mossad. It's all the same thing. Oh, no one's dying. Oh, no, we're winning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, you just had this Ambassador McFall tweet out that Ukraine can still win. He must be on crack. There's no chance of that happening under any circumstances. But this is typical for the regime that currently controls us.
How close to the end is the Ukraine military?
I don't know how much closer they can get to it than they already are. Certainly some people will put up resistance, but to do so is reaching the point of suicide. There are a few pockets left in densely wooded areas where there's some hills and rock and cover that make it harder to get at them. But for the most part, it's effectively over. And the Russians are clearly building up for and planning for some sort of major operation. I don't know if this is just to clean everything out all the way up to the Dnieper River and then to cross it into Kiev. I have no idea. But the longer this takes and the more evidence they see that we have no intention of honoring two critical conditions, which they regard as non-negotiable in Ukraine. One, it must be neutral on the model of, say, the Austrian State Treaty, which I've been writing about for years. The second is that the territories that they have annexed to Russia will be recognized as legitimate. That's Crimea plus, obviously, the oblasts in eastern Ukraine. Beyond that, they're willing to negotiate. But if you're not going to recognize the realities of those two things, then there's no point in talking. So I think the Russians are prepared for the possibility that we won't do that. We will not recognize those things, that we will insist on the impossible, putting Western troops on the ground in Ukraine, any number of things to buy us time to further enhance or build up another apparatus in Western Ukraine that will be hostile to Russia.
In the meantime, Zelensky is still between a rock and a hard place. The rock of a military collapsing, the hard place of a hardcore right wing in that military, which will assassinate him if he tries to bring about an end to hostilities.
I suppose so, although the hard right wing that you're talking about is well paid. That's where a lot of our cash goes. 50% of the cash and equipment obviously disappear into the black market, but the rest of it is used to pay this dying state and the military apparatus and security apparatus that surrounds him. As long as that cash flows, he'll probably hold out, certainly until he sees evidence that the Russians are coming for him. I understand that his wife's Bugatti has been driven to Western Europe to be serviced. That may indicate something. Who knows?
Oh, boy. I would imagine that flow of January 20th. What do you think?
Well, we can hope. I think that the quickest way to end this war, as President Trump has argued, is number one, period, done, out. And that will put an end to the war, because without it, they can't operate for 48, 24, 18 hours. The second part of it is to get all Americans out of Ukraine, whether they are in or out of uniform, whatever their purpose is, pull them out. You do those two things, this war will end. And then the Ukrainians and the Russians can sit down. And if the other European players like Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, if they want to come in as co-signatories to whatever final agreement is reached, they can do that. That would be the easiest thing. But right now we have plans to send General Kellogg over with, I think, something that is probably not going to fly.
What does he have in his briefcase or in his thoughts?
Well, I don't know about any thoughts, but I don't imagine that we have a clear picture. We've listened to all sorts of suggestions that involve some measure of pushing the Russians back off of what they've got. We also have things about bringing in non-NATO European forces or non-European forces as a security zone, on and on and on. All of that is nonsense that the Russians are not going to take under any circumstances.
Switching gears, Colonel, does Iran pose any national security threat whatsoever to the United States?
No, and it really never has, unfortunately. So I don't know what to tell you. Iran is the next chosen enemy of the United States. And I'm sure that, we've adopted Israel's perspective, and the Israeli perspective is quite clear. Iran is the source of all evil and must be destroyed. So I see a lot of evidence for that thinking right now. It doesn't matter which party. It doesn't matter who is governing in Washington.
I think you're right. I think the president-elect has bought that argument. And certainly the people around him have articulated that argument, from Marco Rubio to Mike Waltz to Sebastian Gorka. I don't know that Tulsi Gabbard has, but certainly the people that will have the president's ear on this. Is Prime Minister Netanyahu in a hurry to commence war with the United States against Iran?
I think there's pressure on him to do so. Some of it is self-generated, and some of it comes from people around him and sources, intelligence sources that he has. I think we have to understand something first and foremost. President Trump is someone who is very transactional. And if he asks you to sit down with him and hammer out an agreement, he means it. And he thinks of himself as a brilliant deal maker. Now, this scares the Israelis. It scares lots of people because there's always the danger that President Trump some sort of agreement with Iran, and that he's willing to sit down and come to an agreement. If he thinks it's reasonable, if he thinks it's fair, he thinks profits from it, because that's really how you get a good agreement in international relations. I think President Trump's likely to take it. President Trump is not someone the button and go to war. That's not his inclination at all. The territory right now, thanks to us and the support that they've gotten from CIA and MI6, as well as all the military support and technology that we provide, Syria no longer exists. Now, we can argue whether it ever was, but the point is it's non-existent now. Turkey. We talk a lot about the Israelis. This is a big win for Mr. Netanyahu.